Chapter 1. The Homecoming. Jack Montgomery squinted against the setting sun as his wagon rolled toward Aspen Hollow. 15 years had passed since he'd last seen this land, yet something in the silhouette of the distant mountains stirred memories he'd thought long buried. The loaded wagon creaked beneath him, stacked with lumber, tools, and supplies that represented both his past and the future he intended to build. He'd been just 12 when the orphan train had stopped here, another nameless, homeless child being paraded before potential families. The dusty crossroads, he remembered, had transformed into something more substantial. Brick buildings now stood where wooden structures once leaned precariously, and painted storefronts lined what appeared to be a proper main street. As Jack guided his team down the main thoroughfare, he noted the curious glances from townspeople pausing in their evening activities. He didn't recognize any faces, but then, again, he'd only spent 3 weeks here before being sent back to the orphan train when the Jenkins family could no longer afford to keep him. The sign for Harmon's Saloon caught his eye. At least that was still the same. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since dawn, and he pulled the wagon to a halt outside the establishment. After securing his horses, Jack dusted off his travel-worn clothes as best he could and pushed through the bat-wing doors. The saloon fell quiet as he entered, conversations dropping to murmurs as patrons assessed the newcomer. Jack nodded politely and made his way to the bar, where a heavy-set man with an impressive mustache was polishing glasses. "Evening," Jack said. "Any chance of getting a hot meal this time of day?" "The kitchen's open till 8, the barkeep replied, setting down his towel. "Stew's fresh, bread's day old, but decent." "Sounds perfect." Jack placed a coin on the counter. "And whatever beer you recommend." As the barkeep turned to fill his order, an old-timer at the end of the bar peered at Jack with narrowed eyes. The man was weathered like old leather, with a wild shock of white hair and a beard that needed trimming. "I know you," the old man declared suddenly, pointing a gnarled finger. "You're that orphan boy." Jack turned, surprised. "Do I know you, sir?" The old man hobbled closer, squinting up at Jack's face. "Pete Jenkins. You stayed with my brother Frank and his wife for a spell before they sent you back. Darn shame that was." Recognition dawned slowly. "Mr. Jenkins, I remember you. You had that 3-legged dog." "Tripod," Pete cackled, slapping his knee. "Good memory, boy. Not that you're a boy anymore." He gestured to the barkeep. "Willie, this here's Jack. He was one of them orphan train kids came through 15 years back. I was able to find a family. My name is Jack Montgomery," Jack said as he held out a hand towards the barkeep. Willie shook his head and then nodded, sliding a foaming beer toward Jack. "Frank Jenkins, charity case?" Jack took a sip of his beer, unsurprised by the description. "Frank and Martha were kind to take me in at all. Times were hard then." "Still are for some," Pete said, settling onto the stool beside Jack. "So, what brings you back to Aspen Hollow? Are you just passing through?" By now, several other patrons had drifted closer, curious about the returned orphan. Jack recognized the interest for what it was: small-town curiosity, neither malicious nor particularly welcoming. "I'm here to stay, actually," Jack replied, turning slightly to address the gathered listeners. "I want to purchase the old schoolhouse at the edge of town. I'm planning to convert it into an orphanage." This announcement produced exactly the stir he'd expected: raised eyebrows, exchanged glances, and a low murmur of conversation. "An orphanage here?" Willie asked, setting down Jack's bowl of stew. "What for? We don't have any orphans in Aspen Hollow." Jack broke off a piece of bread. "Every town has children who need homes, whether temporarily or permanently, and the orphan trains still run through these territories, dropping children wherever there's interest." "Like they did with you," Pete observed. Jack nodded. "Exactly like they did with me, except I was fortunate enough to eventually find a real home with the Montgomerys in Missouri." "That is where you've been all this time?" Pete asked. "Missouri? For the most part," Jack confirmed. "They took me in when I was 13. Good family. Ruby Montgomery already had 4 children of her own, but she had room for one more. He smiled at the memory. She used to say that family isn't about blood, but about who catches you when you fall. As he spoke, Jack's mind drifted back to his time on the orphan train. The memories came in flashes. The cramped quarters, the hollow-eyed children, the siblings clinging to each other until they were inevitably separated. He remembered standing on display in town after town, people examining him like livestock, commenting on his height, his build, his potential usefulness as a farmhand. His most vivid memory was of a tiny blonde girl silently crying beside him one night on the train. Moved by her sadness, he decided to give her one of his favorite possessions, a wooden apple he had carved before their journey began. The grateful look in her eyes had stayed with him ever since. "I was lucky," Jack continued, pulling himself back to the present. "Ruby and George Montgomery gave me a real home, taught me carpentry, made sure I got schooling. But I never forgot what it was like before them, with the uncertainty of where I was going to end up. Not all orphan-trained children are lucky to find good situations." Willie refilled Jack's beer without being asked. "Noble idea, I suppose, but that old schoolhouse has been empty for years. The roof leaks and the floor is probably rotted through." "I'm a carpenter by trade," Jack said with a shrug. "I can fix what needs fixing." "It's gonna need more than hammers and nails to run an orphanage," observed a man in a doctor's coat who had been listening quietly from a nearby table. Jack met the doctor's gaze steadily. "I've been planning this for 3 years, sir. I have savings, connections with several reputable orphan agencies back east, and letters of reference. I'm not walking into this blind." The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "I'm Dr. Samuel Grant," he introduced himself. "Town physician. If you're serious about this venture, you might want to stop by my office. I can introduce you to some people who might help, or hinder, depending on their mood." He offered a wry smile. After finishing his meal and answering a few more questions from curious townspeople, Jack took his leave. The summer twilight had deepened to dusk as he led his team toward the old schoolhouse at the edge of town. The building sat silhouetted against the darkening sky, its windows blank and accusing like empty eye sockets. Jack stood before it, hands on his hips, mentally cataloging everything that would need repair. The structure was in better shape than he'd feared, though certainly in worse condition than he'd hoped. Still, he could see past the sagging porch and missing shingles to what it could become, a place of safety, of new beginnings. As crickets began their evening chorus and bats darted overhead, Jack didn't notice the distant figure on horseback watching from the shadow of a cottonwood tree. He was too absorbed in his vision, in the promise he'd made to himself and to the memory of all the lost children he'd once traveled with. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Chapter 2, The Widow's Watch. Eliza Blackwood rose before dawn, as she did every morning regardless of season. The routine brought comfort in its predictability. Dress in practical riding clothes, pin her hair in a no-nonsense knot, review the day's tasks over strong coffee, then make a circuit of the ranch while most hands were still rubbing sleep from their eyes. Morning light seeped through the kitchen windows as she scanned the ledger from the previous day's cattle sales. The Blackwood Ranch had thrived under her management these past 3 years, despite numerous predictions of its imminent failure after Harold's death. She permitted herself a small smile of satisfaction at the healthy figures before closing the book and tucking it into her desk. "Morning, Mrs. Blackwood," her foreman greeted as she stepped onto the porch. Todd Fletcher was already saddled and waiting, his weathered face respectful but not deferential. He'd been one of the few who hadn't questioned her ability to run the ranch, though she sometimes caught concern in his eyes when he thought she was pushing herself too hard. "Good morning, Todd. South pasture today?" She swung easily into the saddle of her mare, Penny. He nodded. "I'm thinking we should move the herd to the lower meadow by week's end. That new well is producing nicely." They rode in near silence through the awakening ranch. Cowhands tipped their hats as she passed, earning brisk nods in return. Eliza maintained a careful distance between herself and her employees, close enough to command loyalty, distant enough to command respect. She'd learned early in widowhood that familiarity with a female boss too easily bred contempt. After completing the morning inspection and discussing fence repairs with Todd, Eliza returned to the main house. In the privacy of her bedroom, she allowed herself the one indulgence in her otherwise disciplined day. From her bureau drawer beneath carefully folded handkerchiefs, she withdrew a small rag doll, its fabric worn thin by years of handling. Eliza touched the doll's faded yarn hair, a brief caress that connected her to a past she revealed to no one. Then she tucked the doll away again and proceeded to change into a more appropriate outfit for town, a tailored navy skirt and matching jacket. An hour later, Eliza guided her buggy down Aspen Hollow's main street, acknowledging greetings with polite smiles that were never quite sincere. She had several errands. She needed to go to the general store for supplies, the bank to deposit yesterday's cattle payments, and a meeting with Mayor Wilson about the upcoming Founders' Day celebration. At Lang's General Store, she was sorting through a shipment of new ledger books when she overheard the conversation at the counter. "Arrived yesterday evening, wagon loaded with lumber and tools," Mrs. Lang was saying excitedly to Mrs. Peterson. "Pete Jenkins recognized him right off. It's that orphan boy the Jenkins family took in years ago. Jack Montgomery's his name." "What's he doing back here?" Mrs. Peterson asked, leaning in conspiratorially. "Claims he's fixing up the old schoolhouse to make an orphanage, if you can believe it." Eliza's hand stilled on the leather-bound ledger she'd been examining. An orphanage? In Aspen Hollow? The idea was preposterous. Their small town was hardly equipped for such an institution. "I heard he's looking for financial backers," Mrs. Lang continued. "Dr. Grant seems to think it's a fine idea, but you know how soft-hearted Samuel is about children." "Well, I think it's inappropriate," Mrs. Peterson declared. "What do we know about this man? And orphans can be so difficult? My cousin in Denver took in an orphan girl once, caught her stealing silver spoons within a fortnight." Mrs. Lang noticed Eliza then. "Oh, Mrs. Blackwood, I didn't see you there. Finding everything you need?" "Yes, thank you," Eliza replied smoothly, bringing her selections to the counter. "I'll take these ledgers and the usual monthly supplies." Mrs. Lang began tallying the items. "Have you heard about the newcomer in town, Jack Montgomery? He's converting the old schoolhouse into an orphanage." "Yes, I overheard." Eliza kept her tone neutral. "What do you think of the idea?" Mrs. Lang asked, clearly eager for Eliza's opinion as one of the town's most prominent citizens. "I think good intentions don't always translate to practical solutions," Eliza replied carefully. "But I haven't met the man, so I'll reserve judgment." "Oh, but you should meet him," Mrs. Lang exclaimed. "Being the town's most successful businesswoman, your input would be valuable, and with your charitable work—" "I prefer to keep my charitable activities private, Mrs. Lang," Eliza interrupted gently but firmly. "Please have these items delivered to the ranch this afternoon. Good day, ladies." Outside on the boardwalk, Eliza nearly collided with Thomas Reed, the town banker. He tipped his hat, revealing thinning hair carefully arranged to disguise its retreat. "Mrs. Blackwood, a fortunate encounter. I was hoping to call on you this week." Eliza suppressed a sigh. Mr. Reed had been hoping to call for the past year, his courtship as persistent as it was unwelcome. At 45, he considered himself quite the catch, since he was president of Aspen Hollow's only bank, chairman of the town council, and owner of several commercial properties. "Mr. Reed," she acknowledged with a polite nod. "I'm rather pressed for time today." Of course. Perhaps you'd permit me to escort you to your next appointment?" He offered his arm, which Eliza pretended not to notice. "Thank you, but I'm perfectly capable of walking unassisted." She started toward the mayor's office, unsurprised when Mr. Reed fell into step beside her. "I assume you've heard about this orphanage nonsense?" he asked without preamble. "I've heard rumors." "More than rumors, I'm afraid. This Montgomery fellow came to the bank this morning seeking information about loans." Mr. Reed's disapproval was evident in his tone. "The nerve of the man, thinking he can simply arrive in town and establish such an institution without proper consultation with community leaders." "Perhaps he's seeking that consultation now," Eliza observed mildly. Mr. Reed waved a dismissive hand. The old schoolhouse is a valuable property, ideally situated for commercial development. I've had my eye on it for some time. To waste it on charity cases. Children, Mr. Reed, not charity cases. Yes, well, he cleared his throat. My point is that Aspen Hollow has pressing needs for growth that would better serve existing residents. A new mercantile, perhaps, or expansion of the hotel. They had reached the mayor's office. Eliza paused, turning to face the banker directly. Mr. Reed, while I appreciate your concern for the town's development, I'd prefer to form my own opinion after meeting Mr. Montgomery and hearing his plans. Now, if you'll excuse me, Mayor Wilson is expecting me. Reed appeared momentarily taken aback by her dismissal. Perhaps I could call on you this Sunday? The weather promises to be pleasant for a drive. I'm afraid my schedule remains quite full, Mr. Reed. Good day. Eliza entered the mayor's office without waiting for his response, her expression betraying none of the irritation she felt. Later that afternoon, as Eliza rode home, she found herself taking the road that passed by the old schoolhouse, rather than her usual route. She told herself it was mere curiosity about a potential development affecting the town. Nothing more. The abandoned building stood a quarter-mile from the edge of town, set back from the road among a stand of aspens. As she approached, Eliza could see a man working on the sagging front porch, methodically removing rotted boards. Even from a distance, she could tell he was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to physical labor. Eliza reined in Penny behind a thick cluster of trees where she could observe without being immediately noticed. The man, Mr. Montgomery presumably, was now measuring replacement boards, marking them with precise movements before cutting. There was something in his determined focus that triggered a half-forgotten memory, an echo of something she'd buried long ago. She shook off the unsettling feeling. What did it matter who this man was or what he was planning? If his orphanage scheme failed, as such impractical idealism usually did, it would be of no consequence to her. Yet as Eliza turned Penny toward home, she found herself glancing back over her shoulder at the solitary figure still working as the afternoon light gilded his movements. For reasons she couldn't or wouldn't articulate even to herself, she suspected Jack Montgomery might prove more consequential to Aspen Hollow than anyone anticipated. Chapter 3. First Encounter. Jack wiped sweat from his brow as he waited outside Mayor Wilson's office. 3 days of intensive work on the schoolhouse had already yielded progress. The porch was now structurally sound, and he'd replaced the most damaged roof sections. Still, there was a mountain of work ahead before the building would be habitable, let alone suitable for children. The mayor's secretary, a pinch-faced woman with spectacles perched on her nose, eyed Jack with thinly veiled disapproval. He'd cleaned up as best he could before coming into town, but his hands were still stained with honest work, his clothes utilitarian rather than fashionable. "The mayor will see you now, Mr. Montgomery," she announced finally, her tone suggesting she found the name itself dubious. Mayor Wilson proved more welcoming than his gatekeeper. A portly man with a generous mustache and an even more generous smile, he rose from behind his desk to shake Jack's hand. "Mr. Montgomery, I've been looking forward to meeting you. Please, have a seat." He gestured to a chair before retaking his own. "Dr. Grant speaks highly of your plans." "I appreciate Dr. Grant's support," Jack replied, settling into the offered chair. "I'm hoping to gain yours as well, Mr. Mayor. The old schoolhouse needs significant repairs, and I want to ensure I'm following all proper procedures." "Commendable attitude," Wilson nodded approvingly, "though I must tell you, there's been some concern expressed about your plans, particularly from certain business interests who had other ideas for that property." "Thomas Reed," Jack guessed, recalling his chilly reception at the bank the previous day. Wilson's eyebrows rose. "You've met our esteemed banker already?" Briefly, he made his position quite clear. The mayor chuckled. "I imagine he did. Thomas Reed has been eyeing that schoolhouse lot for commercial development since the new school was built, but the property is legally owned by the town, and your intended use doesn't violate any ordinances. So there shouldn't be any legal obstacles?" Jack pressed. None that I can see, though you will need to get approval from the town council. You will also need to fill out some papers. Mayor Wilson began, shuffling through papers on his desk. I have the forms here somewhere. A knock at the door interrupted his search. The secretary poked her head in. Mrs. Blackwood is here for your 10 o'clock, Mayor. Ah, send her in, send her in. Perfect timing, actually. Wilson stood as the door opened wider. Jack rose as well, turning to greet the newcomer. His first impression was of composed elegance. A woman of perhaps 30 stepped into the office, dressed in a navy blue ensemble that emphasized her trim figure and complemented her fair complexion. Blonde hair was arranged in a sophisticated knot, not a strand out of place. Her features were fine and aristocratic, with high cheekbones and a delicately pointed chin. But it was her eyes that caught and held Jack's attention. They were a clear, perceptive blue that seemed to assess and catalog everything they touched. Mrs. Blackwood, allow me to introduce Mr. Jack Montgomery, the mayor said. He's the gentleman I mentioned who wants to purchase the old schoolhouse. Mr. Montgomery, this is Mrs. Eliza Blackwood, owner of the Blackwood Ranch and chairwoman of our town improvement committee. Jack extended his hand. A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Blackwood. I've heard your name mentioned frequently since my arrival. Eliza's handshake was brief but firm, her expression polite but guarded. Mr. Montgomery, your plans have certainly created a stir in our small community. Mrs. Blackwood is one of our most prominent citizens, Wilson explained to Jack. Her late husband, Harold Blackwood, was instrumental in bringing the railroad spur to Aspen Hollow, and Mrs. Blackwood herself has continued his legacy of civic involvement. While expanding the ranch to become the region's most successful cattle operation, Jack added, recalling comments he'd overheard. Impressive accomplishments. A flicker of surprise crossed Eliza's face before her composed mask returned. Thank you, but I merely built upon the foundation my husband established. Mayor Wilson gestured for them both to sit. Since you're here for the committee meeting, perhaps you might offer some insights? Your experience with both business matters and town regulations would be invaluable. Jack recognized the political maneuvering. The mayor was clearly attempting to involve someone with influence early in the process, perhaps to smooth potential conflicts. He wasn't opposed to the strategy, particularly if this Mrs. Blackwood could help secure the town's support. I'd welcome any advice, Jack said, turning toward Eliza, particularly from someone with established roots in Aspen Hollow. My goal is to create a home for children who need one, but I understand that introducing such a facility affects the entire community. Eliza regarded him with that same clear, assessing gaze. And what qualifies you to establish and run such a facility, Mr. Montgomery? Beyond good intentions, of course. The question was direct but not hostile. She was a businesswoman seeking credentials. Jack respected the approach. I have practical experience in child care through my work with the St. Louis Children's Aid Society over the past 5 years, he answered honestly. I've maintained correspondence with several Eastern orphanages about best practices, and I've secured preliminary agreements for placements once the facility is operational. As for resources, I have sufficient personal funds for the renovation and initial operating costs, though I hope to establish community support for long-term sustainability. And your personal interest in this particular venture? Eliza pressed, her eyes never leaving his face. Jack considered how much to reveal in this first meeting and then decided he'd be upfront and honest. I was an orphan train rider myself, Mrs. Blackwood. I understand firsthand what these children experience and what they need most. He watched Eliza's face carefully, which she kept intentionally blank. Which is stability, respect, the knowledge that their worth isn't measured solely by their usefulness to adults. Jack leaned forward slightly. The current system too often separates siblings, places children with families unprepared for the responsibility, or worse, with those who see them merely as cheap labor. Noble sentiments, Eliza acknowledged. But sentiment doesn't feed children or keep them warm at night. Have you calculated ongoing operational costs, staffing requirements, educational provisions? Before Jack could answer, Mayor Wilson cleared his throat. Perhaps this detailed discussion would be better continued after our scheduled meeting, Mrs. Blackwood. The other committee members will be arriving shortly. Of course, Mayor. Eliza nodded, her expression softening fractionally. My apologies for the interrogation, Mr. Montgomery. Jack smiled. No apology necessary. I'd rather answer difficult questions now than face unanticipated problems later. A pragmatic approach, she observed, a hint of approval in her tone. Jack saw an opening. In fact, Mrs. Blackwood, I was hoping to speak with prominent citizens about potential support for the orphanage. Your perspective would be particularly valuable, given your standing in the community. Perhaps we could continue our conversation another time? Something flickered in Eliza's eyes. There was wariness, perhaps, or an emotion less easily defined. I maintain a rather full schedule, Mr. Montgomery, between ranch operations and civic obligations. Of course, at your convenience. Mayor Wilson intervened. Mrs. Blackwood has been most generous with various community initiatives. Perhaps once your plans are more developed. Indeed, Eliza said, her tone cooling noticeably. A detailed business proposal would be essential before any serious consideration. Children aren't livestock, Mr. Montgomery, to be acquired and maintained without careful planning. Jack stiffened slightly at the implied criticism. I couldn't agree more, Mrs. Blackwood, which is precisely why I believe local, personalized care is superior to the current system. Is it? Eastern institutions have established procedures, trained staff, and consistent oversight. Your alternative lacks all three. Those institutions also lack the individual attention children need to thrive, Jack countered. I've seen the results of institutional care. Children who receive adequate food and shelter but never develop the emotional connections necessary for healthy development. Eliza's chin lifted slightly. And you believe yourself capable of providing these emotional connections to how many children exactly, while simultaneously maintaining the facility, securing funding, and managing all administrative responsibilities? Mayor Wilson glanced between them nervously. Perhaps we could? I'll have assistance, Jack interrupted, his voice remaining even despite his rising frustration. And I'd rather attempt something imperfect than accept a demonstrably harmful system as the only option. Eliza regarded him steadily, neither retreating from nor escalating the disagreement. Impractical idealism can cause more damage than pragmatic imperfection, Mr. Montgomery. Children rely on adults to make responsible decisions, not merely well-intentioned ones. A knock at the door announced the arrival of the other committee members, effectively ending their debate. Jack rose, nodding politely to Eliza. A valid concern, Mrs. Blackwood. I look forward to demonstrating that my plans are both idealistic and practical. Thank you for your time. And yours, Mayor Wilson. As Jack departed, he noticed a slight hesitation in Eliza's typically confident posture, a momentary stillness that suggested their exchange had affected her more than her composed expression revealed. It was a small tell, but to Jack, who had spent years learning to read people's unspoken reactions, it confirmed his suspicion that Mrs. Eliza Blackwood's opposition stemmed from something deeper than mere practical concern. Chapter 4. Town Division. Word spread quickly about Jack's orphanage plans. Within a week of his arrival, the old schoolhouse had become a point of curiosity for many Aspen Hollow residents. Even though he hadn't officially purchased the property, he figured it was a matter of time and he might as well get going on the needed repairs. Some people simply rode by slowly, observing from a distance. Others, particularly children, were bolder, venturing onto the property to watch Jack work. He didn't mind the audience. In fact, he welcomed the opportunity to engage with the community, especially the children. When 10-year-old Billy Jenkins, Pete's grandnephew, he discovered, asked if he could help, Jack set him to sorting nails by size. Soon, Billy had recruited 2 friends, and Jack found himself with a small crew of eager assistants. At one point, Billy looked at him with concern. "My pa says some folks don't want orphans here." Jack placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Some people are afraid of change, Billy. That's natural. Our job is to show them there's nothing to fear. Can I still help with the orphanage, even when the other children come? Billy asked, his expression hopeful. Absolutely. In fact, I'm counting on local children to help the newcomers feel welcome. Jack smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. Now, how about you and your friends help me carry these boards inside? The boys eagerly tackled the task, their enthusiasm a welcome counterpoint to the sheriff's cautious skepticism. Jack knew he'd face more opposition, but he was prepared. He'd encountered similar resistance during his work with the Children's Aid Society in St. Louis. People often claimed to care about orphan children in the abstract, but balked at actual involvement with them. His prediction proved accurate that evening when Mayor Wilson called a town meeting to discuss the orphanage proposal. The community hall was packed, with opinions clearly divided before the discussion even began. Jack sat quietly in the front row as the mayor explained the purpose of the meeting. As many of you know, Mr. Jack Montgomery has committed to purchasing the old schoolhouse and intends to convert it into an orphanage. He's here tonight to answer questions and address any concerns. Thomas Reed immediately stood, straightening his waistcoat with an air of authority. I believe many of us have significant concerns about this proposal, Mayor. Introducing orphans, children with unknown backgrounds and potential behavioral issues, into our community presents considerable risks. Several heads nodded in agreement. Reed continued, warming to his subject. Additionally, there's the matter of resource allocation. Our town has limited funds for services. Would these orphans attend our school, utilize our doctor's limited time, and who precisely would oversee this operation to ensure proper management? Valid questions, Mr. Reed, Mayor Wilson acknowledged. Mr. Montgomery, would you care to address these concerns? Jack rose and faced the assembled townspeople, recognizing curiosity, skepticism, and outright hostility in various faces. He also noticed Eliza Blackwood sitting near the back, her expression carefully neutral. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all, Jack began. I understand your concerns. Any change to a community should be carefully considered. Yes, the children at the orphanage would attend the local school, as is their right under territorial law. They would require medical attention like any children, though I've already discussed arrangements with Dr. Grant to minimize impact on his practice. Dr. Grant nodded from his seat, offering visible support. As for oversight, Jack continued, I'll be living at the facility full-time and will be primarily responsible for its management. I have experience in child care, carpentry for maintenance and basic education. For specialized needs, I plan to engage community resources appropriately and compensate them fairly for their services. Mrs. Lang from the general store raised her hand. How many children are we talking about, Mr. Montgomery? Initially, no more than 6, Jack answered. I believe that the building could eventually accommodate up to 20, but that would be years in the future and would require additional staff and resources. Thomas Reed scoffed audibly. 6, 20? The number is irrelevant. The principle remains the same. We'd be introducing unknown elements into our community, drawing resources away from established families and potentially increasing crime rates. That's unfair, Mr. Reed, Dr. Grant objected, standing. These are children in need, not criminals in training. Statistics from eastern cities clearly show correlations between orphan status and criminal behavior. Mr. Reed countered. Correlation isn't causation, Jack interjected calmly. Children who receive proper care and education rarely turn to criminal activity. It's neglect and desperation that create such patterns, not the mere fact of being orphaned. An unexpected voice joined the debate. Mr. Reed's concerns about resources might be valid if the orphanage were seeking public funding, but as I understand it, Mr. Montgomery is using private funds for this venture. All heads turned toward Abigail Chen, the soft-spoken seamstress who rarely participated in town meetings. As the only Chinese resident of Aspen Hollow, she typically kept to herself, running a small but excellent tailoring business from her shop on the edge of town. The children deserve a chance, she continued, her voice gaining strength despite her evident discomfort at being the center of attention. In my experience, those who have faced hardship often develop greater compassion and work ethic than those born to privilege. Jack nodded gratefully to her. Thank you, Miss Chen. You're correct that initial funding is private, Long-term, I hope the orphanage will become self-sustaining through a combination of state subsidies, community support, and appropriate work programs for the older children. Work programs? Mrs. Peterson asked sharply. Sounds like you're planning to use child labor. Absolutely not, Jack replied firmly. I'm referring to age-appropriate chores and skills training. Gardening for food production, basic carpentry, sewing, cooking. The same skills any parent would teach their children to prepare them for adulthood. The debate continued for nearly an hour, opinions ricocheting between enthusiastic support and vehement opposition. Jack remained calm throughout, answering questions truthfully and refusing to be provoked by Reed's increasingly aggressive challenges. Finally, Mayor Wilson called for order. Mr. Montgomery has answered our questions patiently and thoroughly. As the intended use violates no town ordinances, the council has no grounds to prevent the establishment of this orphanage. I am in favor of allowing him to purchase the property. However, he added as Mr. Reed began to object, we can certainly establish reasonable oversight to ensure proper operation. And who would provide this oversight? Mr. Reed demanded. The town council could appoint a committee, Mayor Wilson suggested. Perhaps including Dr. Grant for medical concerns, Sheriff Porter for safety matters, and Mrs. Blackwood for business oversight. A murmur ran through the crowd at this last suggestion. All eyes turned to Eliza, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings. Mrs. Blackwood, the mayor continued, your experience with managing complex operations would be invaluable. Would you be willing to serve in this capacity? Jack watched Eliza carefully, curious about her response. Their brief interaction in the mayor's office hadn't left him optimistic about her support. Eliza rose gracefully, her composed demeanor a stark contrast to the heated emotions that had dominated the meeting. While I appreciate the nomination, Mayor, I believe it would be premature to form an oversight committee before Mr. Montgomery has established his operation. Perhaps a more prudent approach would be to allow him to rent the property. Then he can proceed with the renovation and present a detailed operational plan to the council before determining what, if any, oversight is required. Purchasing it could come later. Her measured response surprised Jack. It neither endorsed nor condemned his plans, but created space for him to prove himself without immediate interference. A reasonable suggestion, Mayor Wilson agreed, looking relieved. Does the council concur? Despite Mr. Reed's visible frustration, the majority nodded agreement. The mayor turned to Jack. Mr. Montgomery, can you provide such an operational plan within the next month? Gladly, Jack replied. Thank you for the opportunity. As the meeting dispersed, Jack made his way toward Eliza, who was speaking quietly with Dr. Grant near the door. She noticed his approach, her expression once again becoming carefully neutral. Mrs. Blackwood, Jack said, I wanted to thank you for your suggestion to the council. It was unexpectedly helpful. I merely advocated for a logical process, Mr. Montgomery. Her tone was cool, but not hostile. I neither supported nor opposed your venture. Even so, you created space for a fair hearing rather than an immediate judgment. That's more than many would have done. Dr. Grant smiled between them. Mrs. Blackwood has always valued thorough assessment over hasty conclusions. It's one reason her business ventures succeed while others fail. Eliza acknowledged the compliment with a slight nod. If you'll excuse me, I should be returning to the ranch. Good evening, Mr. Montgomery. As she departed, Thomas Reed approached, his expression sour. Quite the performance, Mr. Montgomery. You've obviously charmed some of our more susceptible citizens, but don't mistake a temporary reprieve for acceptance. Jack met the banker's gaze evenly. I'm not looking for acceptance, Mr. Reed. Just the opportunity to help children who need it. If that goal conflicts with your vision for Aspen Hollow, I'm sorry for it. This town has thrived under the guidance of those who understand progress, Reed replied. Importing social problems from eastern cities isn't progress. Children aren't social problems, Mr. Reed. They're human beings deserving of care and opportunity. Jack kept his voice level despite his growing irritation. Perhaps if you spent time with some of these children, you'd see them differently. Reed's mouth tightened. I see them precisely as they are, a drain on resources better allocated elsewhere, and I see you as what you are, a self-righteous meddler using charity as a means to importance." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "This isn't over, Montgomery. Not by a long shot. You will not be purchasing that property." With that, the banker turned and strode away, leaving Jack to wonder how a man could so thoroughly mistake basic human decency for self-promotion. But Mr. Reed's hostility, while troubling, wasn't unexpected. Jack had faced similar opposition before and knew it often stemmed from fear rather than genuine malice. What puzzled him more was Eliza Blackwood's ambiguous position. Despite her coolness, she'd effectively prevented Mr. Reed from obstructing his plans immediately. Was it merely her sense of fair process, as she claimed, or was there something more behind her carefully maintained neutrality? Jack watched as she climbed into her buggy outside, her posture perfect, her movements precise. For a brief moment, as she thought herself unobserved, her composed expression softened into something more pensive, almost vulnerable. Then, noticing his gaze, she straightened, nodded briefly in his direction, and took up the reins. As her buggy pulled away, Jack couldn't shake the sense that there was far more to Eliza Blackwood than the controlled, practical businesswoman she presented to the world. What that might be, however, remained a mystery, one he found himself increasingly interested in solving. Chapter 5. Persistent Pursuit. The summer heat intensified as June progressed, but Jack refused to slow his renovation pace. Rising before dawn and working until dusk, he transformed the schoolhouse day by day. The roof no longer leaked, new windows let in light without drafts, and the sagging floors had been reinforced or replaced. The exterior now boasted fresh paint, a warm golden yellow that glowed in the morning sun. Word of his progress spread through town, drawing curious visitors and occasional volunteers. Billy Jenkins and his friends became regular helpers, showing up after school to assist with simple tasks in exchange for carpentry lessons. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Jack was measuring lumber for the dormitory partitions when Abigail Chen appeared, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Miss Chen," Jack greeted her, setting aside his work. "This is a pleasant surprise." The seamstress offered a shy smile. "I thought you might appreciate lunch. It's nothing elaborate. Just bao and pickled vegetables." "That's extremely kind of you," Jack said, genuinely touched by the gesture. He gestured to a recently completed bench on the porch. "Would you care to join me?" She hesitated briefly, then nodded. As they sat together in the shade, Jack sampled the steamed buns filled with savory pork. The food was a welcome change from his usual simple meals. "These are delicious," he said appreciatively. "I haven't had good bowls since St. Louis." "You've had Chinese food before?" Abigail asked, surprised. Jack nodded. "St. Louis has a small but vibrant Chinese community. Some of the children I worked with at the Aid Society were Chinese." "How were they treated?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral but her eyes revealing deeper concern. Jack met her gaze directly. "Not always well," he acknowledged. "There's much ignorance and prejudice. It's one reason I believe in creating safe places for all children." Abigail nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. After a moment she asked, "How are your plans progressing? I heard Mr. Reed has been difficult about your supply orders." Jack grimaced. "News travels fast. Yes, there have been some unfortunate delays with financing the larger supply orders through his bank, but I'm finding workarounds." "It's not right," Abigail said, her soft voice carrying unexpected firmness. "Using his position to hinder a worthy project that you have permission to do? It's not unusual, unfortunately. People in power often resist changes they don't control." Jack shrugged. "I've faced worse obstacles." Abigail was quiet for a moment, eating delicately. Then she said, "When the orphanage opens, I could help with teaching. I was a teacher in San Francisco before coming here." Jack looked at her with surprise. "You were? But why?" "Why am I a seamstress here instead?" She smiled sadly. "No school would hire a Chinese woman in this territory. Sewing was something I could do independently." Jack felt a surge of anger at the wasted potential, the narrow-mindedness that would deny children an educated instructor based solely on her heritage. "I would be honored to have your help with teaching," he said sincerely. "The children would benefit tremendously from your knowledge." She ducked her head slightly, but not before Jack caught her pleased expression. "Thank you for saying so. Many would not agree." "Many are wrong," Jack stated firmly. "Judge a person by their character and capabilities, not their ancestry or appearance. That's what I believe and what I'll teach the children here." Their conversation continued, touching on educational approaches, books they'd both read, and Abigail's observations about Aspen Hollow's residents. Her insights proved invaluable, particularly regarding the town's social dynamics and unspoken alliances. As she prepared to leave, Abigail mentioned casually, "Mrs. Blackwood visits the Chen family who farms north of town quite regularly. They provide specialty produce for her ranch kitchen, and she's arranged for their oldest son to attend the Territorial College next year." Jack raised an eyebrow at this information. "That seems at odds with her public persona." "Mrs. Blackwood does many things quietly that she doesn't speak about publicly," Abigail replied. "She has her reasons, I think, for keeping certain involvement private." It was yet another piece of the puzzle that was Eliza Blackwood. She was a woman who apparently funded a Chinese boy's education privately while maintaining a carefully neutral stance on social issues publicly. Jack found himself increasingly intrigued by these contradictions. That afternoon, he finalized his revised proposal for the orphanage, incorporating practical suggestions he'd gathered from various townspeople. The document outlined staffing plans, himself as director with part-time assistance from qualified community members, educational provisions, coordination with the town school plus supplementary instruction at the orphanage, and detailed financial projections for the first 3 years of operation. What the proposal needed now was a business review from someone with genuine expertise, someone like Eliza Blackwood. Jack decided it was time for a more direct approach. The following morning, he decided to ride out to the Blackwood Ranch, but as he rode through town, he spotted Eliza's distinctive buggy outside Dr. Grant's office. As he crossed the street, Eliza emerged from the doctor's building, carrying what appeared to be a folded quilt. "Mrs. Blackwood," Jack called, approaching at a respectful distance. "A fortunate encounter?" Eliza turned, her expression briefly showing surprise before settling into its usual composed neutrality. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery." Jack gestured to the package in her arms. "Good morning. May I help you with that to your buggy?" She hesitated, then handed him the quilt. As she did so, Jack recognized the distinctive pattern of interlocking stars. It was one of Mrs. Lang's creations from the sewing circle he'd seen displayed in the general store window. "This is beautiful work," he commented as they walked toward her buggy. "I saw this in Mrs. Lang's store." A flicker of surprise crossed Eliza's face. "You have a good eye, Mr. Montgomery." "My adoptive mother was an avid quilter," he explained. "I spent many evenings helping her sort fabric scraps." He glanced at the bundled quilt. "Is this a gift?" Eliza seemed to consider whether to answer, then said, "It's for the Henderson child. She's been ill and their cabin gets cold at night." Jack placed the quilt carefully in the buggy, then turned to face Eliza directly. "So you do care about children's welfare, despite your reservations about my orphanage?" Her expression cooled. "I never suggested I didn't care about children, Mr. Montgomery. I questioned the practicality of your specific approach." "Which is why I sought you out," Jack replied. "I've completed a detailed operational plan for the orphanage, incorporating many practical suggestions from townspeople. What it needs now is a thorough review from someone with genuine business acumen. Someone like you." Eliza regarded him with that clear, assessing gaze he remembered from their first meeting. "You are persistent, Mr. Montgomery." "When it matters, yes." "And why does it matter so much to you?" she asked, genuine curiosity entering her tone. "There are established systems for orphan children, imperfect certainly, but functioning. Why devote your life to creating an alternative?" The directness of her question deserved an equally direct answer. "Because I was one of those children, Mrs. Blackwood. I was 12 when the orphan train brought me through these territories. Her expression remained composed, but Jack noticed how her fingers tightened slightly on her reticule. "I know what it's like to stand on display while adults discuss your potential usefulness," he continued. "To be separated from the only friends you've made because someone chose them but not you. To lie awake wondering if your next placement will be your last, or just another temporary stop." Jack wasn't seeking pity. He stated these facts as simple truths, part of a reality Eliza needed to understand if she were to comprehend his motivation. "I was fortunate," he added. "I eventually found a real home with the Montgomerys, but I had a friend on that train, a younger boy named David. We promised to find each other again someday, but I never did. I don't even know if he survived. That uncertainty, that loss of connection, it's something no child should experience if it can be prevented." Eliza was silent for a long moment, her gaze focused somewhere beyond Jack's shoulder. When she finally spoke, her voice held a new quality, less businesslike, more contemplative. "The Orphan train stopped here 15 years ago," she said. "I recall there was some discussion about it at a church meeting. Yes, I was placed with the Jenkins family briefly. They were kind, but couldn't afford another mouth to feed when the drought affected their crops. And you remembered this place after all this time?" There was something in her tone Jack couldn't quite identify. "I remember more than you might expect," Jack replied. "I remember a girl about my age on that train who cried silently at night. I then gave her my prized possession, a small wooden apple that I had carved. It was my hope that it might comfort her as it had me." He didn't notice how Eliza stiffened at these details, her composure momentarily fracturing before she carefully reconstructed it. "I remember the kindness of strangers more than the cruelties," Jack continued. "That's what stayed with me. How much difference simple compassion can make to a child who has nothing else to hold on to." Eliza's hands were trembling slightly, though she quickly clasped them together to hide the reaction. Jack noticed but misinterpreted it as discomfort with his forwardness. "Forgive me," he said, stepping back slightly. "I didn't mean to burden you with personal history. My point was simply that I understand these children's needs from experience, not merely theory." "No apology necessary," Eliza said, her voice steady despite her evident tension. "Your perspective is relevant to your qualifications." She seemed to come to a decision. "You may leave your operational plan with Mrs. Lang at the general store. I'll review it when I have time and provide written feedback." It was less than Jack had hoped for, but more than he had expected. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood. I appreciate your willingness to consider it." She nodded briskly, gathering her reins. "Good day, Mr. Montgomery." As her buggy pulled away, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something in their exchange had affected Eliza more deeply than she wanted to reveal. Her composed exterior had cracked, however briefly, and the glimpse beneath had shown something unexpected, not cold pragmatism, but carefully contained emotion. What had triggered it? His mention of the Orphan train, the story of the apple, or something else entirely that he couldn't identify? Whatever the case, Jack felt certain that Eliza Blackwood's apparent indifference to his cause was a carefully maintained facade rather than genuine disinterest. The question was why, and whether understanding her reasons might help transform her from a reluctant reviewer into a genuine ally. Chapter 6. Half an Apple. Eliza maintained her composure until she reached the privacy of her bedroom at the ranch. Only then, with the door firmly locked behind her, did she allow her mask to slip. Her hands shook violently as she sank onto the edge of her bed, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. He remembered. Not her specifically, she was certain that he didn't recognize her, but he remembered the wooden apple and the crying girl on the train. Those particular details, so casual in his retelling, had shattered the careful wall she'd built between Elizabeth Connors and Eliza Blackwood. When she could breathe normally again, Eliza rose and moved to the cherrywood bureau in the corner. Kneeling beside it, she carefully pried up a loose floorboard and removed a small wooden box from the cavity beneath. The box was plain, unadorned, nothing that would draw attention if accidentally discovered. She carried it to the bed and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside lay 3 treasures. a yellowed newspaper clipping about an orphan train arrival 15 years ago, a faded blue hair ribbon, and half of a small wooden carving shaped like an apple. Eliza picked up the newspaper first, scanning the brief article that listed the arrival of 27 orphans from eastern cities, seeking good Christian homes in the prosperous Western territories. The article noted that 18 had been placed with local families, while the remainder continued westward. No names were mentioned. The children had been as interchangeable as cattle to the newspaper reporter. Next, she touched the blue ribbon reverently. It had been her mother's, the only item Eliza had managed to keep when typhoid took both her parents within a week of each other. The orphanage matrons had allowed her to keep it tied around her wrist, a small kindness in an otherwise brutal transition. Finally, she picked up the half-carving. It was simple but skillfully made, the wood smooth from years of handling. The boy on the train, Jack, she now knew, had carved it himself, though the complete piece had been a whole apple. When they'd been forced to separate, he'd sliced it in two, giving her back half as a friend token. She'd kept it hidden through years at the Harringtons, through her marriage, through everything. It was the only physical proof that Elizabeth Connors had ever existed. Eliza closed her eyes, memories flooding back with painful clarity. She'd been 11 when her parents died, old enough to understand the permanence of death, but too young to have any say in her fate. The orphanage had been cold, institutional, and overcrowded. The orphan train had seemed like deliverance at first, until she understood that she was essentially being offered for inspection at each stop. Margaret Harrington had her eye on Elizabeth. She went over to her and wiped the girl's hands and face with a handkerchief before presenting her to her husband Henry. They'd wanted a daughter, not out of parental longing, but to complete their image as a respectable Christian family. A child rescued from unfortunate circumstances would reflect well on their charitable nature. The transformation had begun immediately. Elizabeth became Eliza. It was a more refined name, Margaret declared. Her clothes were replaced, her speech corrected, her history rewritten. She was introduced as a distant relation who had tragically lost her parents, never as an orphan-trained child. The Harringtons had no interest in who she had been, only in who they could shape her to become. And shape her they did into the perfect ornamental daughter. She learned proper etiquette, appropriate conversation topics, and the importance of always maintaining appearances. Emotions were to be controlled, opinions muted, ambitions channeled into acceptable feminine pursuits. When she showed aptitude for mathematics and business, these interests were discouraged as unbecoming. By 18, she had fulfilled her purpose in the Harrington household by securing a socially advantageous marriage to Harold Blackwood. He had been a man Margaret described as established, but who was in reality simply 43, wealthy, and willing to take a young bride with connections but no fortune. The Harringtons had effectively traded their investment in her for Harold's financial and social support of their failing shipping business. Harold hadn't been cruel, merely indifferent. He'd wanted an appropriate hostess for his business dinners, a presentable wife to complete his image as a successful man. He'd given her a comfortable life materially, if not emotionally. When he died 3 years ago, Eliza had experienced not grief, but a strange sense of suspended animation, as if she'd been holding her breath for years and could finally exhale. Running the ranch had been her salvation. For the first time, her intelligence and aptitude for business were assets rather than liabilities. She'd proven her capabilities to the skeptical ranchers and bankers, earned the respect of her employees, and built a life that was, if not completely fulfilling, at least genuinely her own. And now Jack Montgomery had appeared, unknowingly connecting her carefully constructed present to the past she'd buried. Worse, his descriptions of orphaned children, their vulnerability and their need for stability, resonated with memories she'd spent 15 years trying to forget. With sudden decision, Eliza struck a match and held it to the newspaper clipping, watching as the yellowed paper curled and blackened. She dropped the burning fragment into the empty wash basin, ensuring it was completely consumed. No physical evidence of Elizabeth Connors could remain. The risk was too great. The ribbon and carved apple half, however, she couldn't bring herself to destroy. Instead, she returned the ribbon to the box and carefully replaced it beneath the floorboard. But the apple half she slipped into her dress pocket. For some unknown reason, she couldn't bring herself to hide it away. As she washed her face and composed herself once more, Eliza made a resolution. She would maintain her distance from Jack Montgomery and his orphanage project. She would review his proposal as promised, provide strictly professional feedback, and limit any further interactions to necessary business. She could not risk him somehow recognizing her, or worse, awakening the vulnerable girl she had so carefully buried beneath Eliza Blackwood's composed exterior. The next morning, Eliza followed her normal routine as she reviewed ranch accounts, consulting with Fletcher about cattle movements, and inspecting new fence construction in the north pasture. The physical activity and practical concerns helped restore her equilibrium. By late afternoon, she had almost convinced herself that her emotional reaction to Montgomery had been overblown. He had no reason to connect the wealthy widow Eliza Blackwood with the tearful orphan Elizabeth Connors. The half-apple carving could be coincidental. Perhaps he'd given similar tokens to multiple children. Even if he did remember that specific girl from 15 years ago, she bore little physical resemblance to the child she had been. Her rationalization was interrupted by Todd Fletcher, who appeared at her office door with an unusual report. "Mrs. Blackwood, there's a freight wagon headed toward town that just passed our north boundary. The driver said he's carrying a special lumber delivery for the old schoolhouse. Quarter-sawn oak, maple, and some cherry wood. Quality stuff." Eliza frowned. "That seems excessive for a simple orphanage renovation." "That's what I thought," Fletcher agreed. "Especially when the driver mentioned it was all paid for in advance, cash. By Mr. Montgomery? That's the odd part. The driver said the order came through Harrigan's Mill in Junction City and was paid for by an anonymous donor. Montgomery apparently doesn't even know who sent it." Eliza kept her expression carefully neutral, despite the sudden acceleration of her pulse. "How interesting. Perhaps Mr. Montgomery has a benefactor he's unaware of." "Seems likely," Fletcher agreed. "Anyway, thought you'd want to know, given your interest in town developments." "Thank you, Todd. That's all for now." After the foreman departed, Eliza moved to the window, gazing out at the distant mountains. She hadn't planned to intervene in Jack's project, certainly not in any way that could be traced back to her. Yet when she'd overheard Mr. Reed instructing his bank associates to delay processing Jack's lumber order, explicitly to impede the orphanage construction, something in her had rebelled against the injustice. The anonymous lumber purchase had been impulsive and arranged through business contacts in Junction City who owed her favors. She justified it to herself as merely leveling the playing field against Reed's underhanded tactics, not as personal involvement in the orphanage. Now, watching the dust cloud that marked the freight wagon's progress toward town, Eliza wondered if she could maintain that fiction. The truth was more complex, more personal than she wanted to admit, even to herself. Despite her resolution to keep her distance, it seemed some part of her, some remnant of Elizabeth Connors, wasn't content to remain buried after all. Chapter 7. Unexpected Allies. Aspen Hollow's dusty main street reflected shimmering heat waves as Jack made his way toward the post office. A week had passed since the mysterious lumber delivery, and he was still no closer to identifying his benefactor. The accompanying note had been brief and impersonal. "For the children who will find shelter here." No signature, no clues to the sender's identity. Jack had his suspicions, of course. The quality and quantity of lumber suggested someone with both significant means and knowledge of fine woodworking. It was a combination not common in Aspen Hollow. Dr. Grant had denied involvement, though his twinkling eyes suggested he might know more than he was saying. Mayor Wilson had seemed genuinely surprised when Jack thanked him, which left few other possibilities among the town's more affluent citizens. Could it have been Eliza Blackwood? The thought had occurred to him immediately, but her continued cool formality whenever they crossed paths argued against it. Just yesterday she'd returned his operational plan via Mrs. Lang with a sheaf of detailed notes. It was all strictly professional, focusing on financial projections and sustainability concerns, without a hint of personal investment in the project. Jack was still pondering this mystery when a commotion outside the mayor's office caught his attention. A travel-worn wagon had stopped in front of the building, and a man and woman were speaking urgently with Mayor Wilson on the boardwalk. Between them stood a young girl of perhaps 9 or 10, her thin shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed firmly on the ground. Drawing closer, Jack caught fragments of their conversation. "Simply can't feed another mouth," the man was saying. "Times are hard enough with her own 4. Her mother's dying wish that we try," the woman added, her voice tight with what might have been guilt or simple exhaustion. "But it's been 3 months, and we just can't." "I understand your situation," Mayor Wilson was saying, his tone sympathetic but uncomfortable. "But Aspen Hollow doesn't have facilities for orphan children. The closest orphanage is in Denver, or we could arrange for her to join the next orphan train when it comes through Junction City next month." The girl flinched visibly at the word orphan, her small hands clutching a worn carpet bag that clearly contained all her worldly possessions. Jack felt a surge of protective anger, remembering all too well the feeling of being discussed as a problem to be solved rather than a child to be cherished. "Mayor Wilson," he called, approaching the group, "perhaps I can be of assistance?" All eyes turned to him, the adults with curiosity, the child with wary hope quickly suppressed. "Mr. Montgomery," the mayor greeted him, looking relieved. "This is Mr. and Mrs. Parker. They've brought their niece, Jessie, from Nebraska. Unfortunately, they find themselves unable to continue caring for her, and we were discussing alternatives." Jack nodded to the couple, then crouched to the girl's eye level. "Hello, Jessie. My name is Jack." The girl glanced at him briefly, then back at the ground. "Hello," she whispered. "Are you hungry?" Jack asked. When she nodded slightly, he continued, "Mrs. Lang at the general store makes the best ginger cookies in the territory. Would you like one while the adults talk?" Jessie looked questioningly at her aunt, who nodded permission. "Stay where Mrs. Lang can see you," she instructed. As Jack straightened, he noticed Eliza Blackwood emerging from the millinery shop across the street. She paused, observing the scene with that clear, assessing gaze he'd come to recognize. Their eyes met briefly before she continued toward her buggy, though Jack noticed she moved with deliberate slowness, clearly listening to the ongoing conversation. "Mr. Montgomery is establishing an orphanage here in Aspen Hollow," Mayor Wilson was explaining to the Parkers, "though it's not yet operational." "How long until it opens?" Mr. Parker asked, hope mingling with impatience in his voice. "The building renovations are progressing well," Jack answered carefully, "but there's still a lot of work to do. I need to hire staff, and there are supplies that need to be purchased. It might be several weeks, possibly a month or more." Mrs. Parker's face fell. "We can't wait that long. We're already behind on our homestead obligations, and the journey here took more time than we could afford." Jack hesitated, weighing options. The schoolhouse had 2 habitable rooms now, his own small quarters and what would eventually be the kitchen, but it was hardly suitable for a child yet. The dormitories were still under construction, there was no proper bathing facility, and he had no female assistance for a young girl. "I understand your urgency," he said finally, "but rushing a child's placement often leads to poor outcomes for everyone involved. Perhaps we could discuss temporary arrangements while the orphanage is completed?" Mr. Parker frowned. "What sort of arrangements?" "I know people in town who might help," Jack offered. "Dr. Grant has connections with several charitable families, or perhaps you should consider whether separating the child from the only family she has left is truly in her best interest." A cool voice interrupted. All heads turned to find Eliza Blackwood standing at the edge of their group, her expression composed but her eyes fixed on Jessie's small figure visible through the general store window. "Mrs. Blackwood," Mayor Wilson greeted her, surprise evident in his tone. "I didn't realize you were... That is, this is Mr. and Mrs. Parker. They're seeking assistance with their niece's situation." "So, I gathered," Eliza replied. Her gaze shifted to the Parkers, assessing them with the same penetrating look she'd given Jack during their first meeting. "You find yourselves unable to care for your niece financially, is that correct?" Mrs. Parker flushed. "We've tried. Truly we have. But with 4 children of our own and the drought affecting our crops..." And you've explored all possibilities: additional work, assistance from church or community. Eliza's questions were direct, but her tone remained neutral, fact-finding rather than accusatory. "We've exhausted every option," Mr. Parker replied stiffly. "We wouldn't be here otherwise." Eliza nodded slowly, then turned to Jack. "And you believe your orphanage, still under construction and unstaffed, is a better option than this child's own blood relations?" Jack felt a flare of irritation at her implied criticism. "I believe every child deserves stability and care, Mrs. Blackwood. Ideally from family, but if that's not possible, then from those committed to their welfare. And you're prepared to provide that stability, alone, for a girl approaching young womanhood?" The challenge was clear, and Jack recognized its validity despite his frustration. "I've acknowledged the orphanage isn't ready yet. I was exploring temporary arrangements." Eliza held his gaze for a long moment, then turned back to the Parkers. "What financial support would enable you to keep your niece with you?" The blunt question clearly startled the couple. Mr. Parker stammered, We hadn't... That is, would $50 assist with your immediate needs?" Eliza pressed. "Plus arrangements to provide winter supplies for an additional child." Mrs. Parker gasped. Yes, that would make a significant difference, but we couldn't accept charity of that magnitude." "Not charity," Eliza corrected smoothly. "A business arrangement. I regularly ship cattle to Nebraska for distribution. You could act as my local agent, receiving a small commission for coordinating with buyers. The $50 would be an advance against those commissions." Jack watched this exchange with growing admiration for Eliza's practical problem-solving, even as he noted how carefully she was structuring the assistance as a business transaction rather than charity. She was preserving the Parkers' dignity while addressing their needs. Mr. Parker looked stunned but thoughtful. "I do have connections at the stockyards in Lincoln and experience with cattle, but are you certain?" "I don't make business offers lightly, Mr. Parker," Eliza interrupted. "If you believe you can perform the duties required, we have an agreement. If not, we'll need to explore other arrangements." The Parkers exchanged a long look, communicating silently in the way of couples who've weathered hardships together. Finally, Mr. Parker turned back to Eliza. "We'd be honored to represent Blackwood Ranch in Nebraska, Mrs. Blackwood, and grateful for the chance to keep Jessie with us. She's my sister's only child." "Then it's settled," Eliza said with a brisk nod. "Mayor Wilson, perhaps you could assist Mr. Parker with the necessary paperwork while Mrs. Parker collects Jessie? I'll have the advance ready within the hour." As the group dispersed, the Parkers looking relieved and the mayor bemused, Jack found himself alone with Eliza on the boardwalk. "That was remarkably generous of you, Mrs. Blackwood," he said quietly. "It was a business decision," she replied, though without the coolness she typically directed at him. "Family connections are valuable when properly maintained." "Is that all it was?" Jack pressed gently. "A business decision?" Eliza met his gaze directly. "What else would it be, Mr. Montgomery? Compassion, perhaps? Recognition that a child belongs with those who love her, when possible?" Something flickered in Eliza's eyes, a momentary vulnerability quickly suppressed. The girl clearly felt attached to her aunt and uncle despite their difficulties. Separating them permanently seemed unnecessary. Jack nodded slowly. "I agree, which is why I was exploring temporary support, not immediate placement in the orphanage." "Then we're aligned in our assessment, if not our approach." Eliza glanced toward the general store, where Jessie was now smiling tentatively as her aunt explained the new arrangement. "Not all family separations are unavoidable." There was something in her tone, a personal note Jack hadn't heard before, that made him wonder what experiences shaped this conviction. Before he could pursue the thought, Eliza shifted back to her usual businesslike manner. "Your operational plan was thorough, if optimistic in its financial projections. I've noted several areas that require adjustment for realistic sustainability." "I noticed," Jack replied with a slight smile. 15 pages of notes suggest you took the review quite seriously." "I take all business matters seriously, Mr. Montgomery." even those you initially dismissed as impractical idealism? A hint of color touched Eliza's cheeks. I may have been hasty in that assessment. Your plan demonstrates more practical consideration than I initially credited. It was as close to an apology as Jack suspected he would get, and he accepted it with a nod. Thank you for the detailed feedback. I've already begun incorporating your suggestions into the revised plan. Just then, Mrs. Parker emerged from the general store with a now smiling Jessie. The girl's relief at learning she wouldn't be sent away was evident in her brighter eyes and straighter posture. She even managed a small curtsy to Eliza, who acknowledged it with a gracious nod. As the Parkers offered their profuse thanks once more, Jack observed Eliza's composed response as she accepted their gratitude with the perfect balance of graciousness and restraint. It was masterfully done, yet something about it struck Jack as rehearsed, as if she were playing a role she had perfected over years of practice. Who was the real Eliza Blackwood beneath that polished exterior? The businesswoman who framed charity as commerce? The widow who maintained careful distance from emotional entanglements? Or someone else entirely? Chapter 8. Change of plans. August brought relentless heat to Aspen Hollow, the kind that seemed to press down on the town like a physical weight. Despite the oppressive temperatures, work on the orphanage progressed steadily. The main dormitory was now completed, with individual sleeping spaces arranged exactly as Jack had envisioned, each with subtle differences that acknowledged children's varying needs while maintaining overall cohesion. Eliza became more involved in the changes of the orphanage. She stopped by almost daily to check on the progress and gave practical suggestions about daily operations, supply management, and even educational approaches. The change in their working relationship hadn't gone unnoticed in town. Mrs. Peterson had been overheard wondering aloud whether Eliza's interest extended beyond the orphanage to its founder, while Thomas Reed's increasingly sour expressions whenever Jack's name was mentioned suggested he viewed the carpenter as competition for Eliza's attention. Jack did his best to ignore such speculation. His focus remained on completing the orphanage, which now needed only finishing touches before it could welcome its first residents. He had signed the papers a week ago and now owned the building free and clear. With the approval of Mayor Wilson and most of the town council, Mr. Reed couldn't do much more than continue to voice his objections. Jack continued to establish correspondence with several Eastern orphan agencies, arranging for evaluations and eventual certifications, but hadn't expected any placements for at least another month. That timeline changed abruptly one Tuesday morning when the telegraph operator's youngest son came running to the schoolhouse, waving a yellow paper and shouting Jack's name. "Mr. Montgomery, urgent telegram from Chicago." Jack set down his paintbrush and wiped his hands, accepting the telegram with thanks and a coin for the breathless messenger. As he read the brief message, his expression grew serious.
Emergency placement needed, stop. 8-year-old girl, Sadie Miller, stop. Previous arrangement failed, stop. Arriving Thursday afternoon stage, stop. Confirm immediately, stop.
Jack read the telegram twice, mind racing. The orphanage was physically ready to receive children, but he had planned for at least another 2 weeks of preparation, such as stocking supplies, arranging for part-time help with cooking and laundry, finalizing agreements with the town school. Most importantly, he hadn't expected to begin with just one child, particularly not a young girl who would need female supervision at times. He had hoped to have a group of children, preferably siblings. After a moment's consideration, Jack strode to the telegraph office and sent a reply requesting more information on Sadie's situation and asking if placement could be delayed by 2 weeks. The answer came within the hour.
Delay impossible, stop. Child currently temporary mission housing, stop. Guardian deceased 3 weeks, stop. No family located, stop. If unable to accept, will be sent Western Orphan train, stop.
The Western Orphan train. Jack knew what that meant. Sadie would join dozens of other children shuttled from town to town like human cargo, displayed at each stop for potential families to inspect and select or reject. Some found genuine homes. Many found merely employers seeking cheap labor. No child deserved that uncertainty if it could be prevented. With renewed determination, Jack made his decision. He would spend the next 2 days completing essential preparations and arranging temporary assistance. When little Sadie Miller arrived on Thursday's stage, she would find not just shelter, but a genuine welcome. His first step was to visit Dr. Grant, who responded to the news with characteristic practicality. 8 years old, you say? Let me think. Mrs. Carmichael might be available for day help with cooking and such. Her daughter's family just moved to Denver, so she's at loose ends. And I'll check the girl's health when she arrives, of course. Jack nodded his thanks and then headed directly to the Blackwood Ranch, his mind already cataloging all the preparations needed before Thursday. The main dormitory could accommodate up to 12 children comfortably, but it wasn't ideal for a single child, especially one who had recently lost her guardian and faced so much upheaval. Perhaps the small room adjacent to his quarters could be quickly converted into a more private, less institutional space for Sadie until other children arrived. He was so deep in thought that he nearly missed seeing Eliza when he reached the ranch. She was in the corral, not the office, observing as a ranch hand worked with a spirited bay colt. Her riding habit, a tailored jacket and split skirt in deep burgundy, complemented her trim figure, while her hair was secured in a simpler style than usual, practical for outdoor work, yet still elegant. She noticed his approach, surprise flickering briefly across her features before she excused herself from the training session and met Jack at the corral fence. "Mr. Montgomery, this is unexpected. I apologize for the unscheduled visit," Jack said, removing his hat, "but there's been a development that requires immediate attention." Eliza's expression sharpened with interest. "What sort of development?" "The orphanage's first resident will be arriving on Thursday's stage from Chicago. A girl named Sadie Miller, 8 years old, recently orphaned with no family to take her in." "Thursday?" Eliza repeated, her tone indicating she shared his concern about the timeline. "That's less than 48 hours from now. Is the facility truly ready for occupation?" "Structurally, yes. The dormitories are completed, basic furnishings installed, kitchen functional. What we lack are certain supplies, arrangements for female supervision, and—" Jack hesitated. "Is delay an option?" Eliza interrupted, her gaze direct. "Not realistically. The alternative is placing Sadie on the Western Orphan train circuit." Something flickered in Eliza's eyes at the mention of the orphan trains, but she quickly refocused on practical matters. What specifically is needed before Thursday? Jack outlined the essentials: bedding, girls' clothing in appropriate sizes, personal care items, arrangements for female supervision during certain times of day. He had already planned to engage Mrs. Carmichael for cooking and general assistance, but ideally a woman would be present or nearby during the night, at least until Sadie adjusted to her new surroundings. Eliza listened attentively, her expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Carmichael is a suitable choice for daily assistance, but the overnight supervision presents a challenge. The obvious solution would be for the child to stay at my ranch temporarily, where my housekeeper, Mrs. Gonzalez, could provide appropriate female oversight." Jack stared at her, genuinely surprised by the suggestion. "You would be willing to take her in?" "It's a practical solution to an immediate problem," Eliza replied, though Jack detected a hint of defensiveness in her tone. "My home has ample space, experienced staff, and is close enough to the orphanage for you to maintain daily contact with the child while completing the facility preparations." "It's an incredibly generous offer," Jack acknowledged. "But are you certain? Taking in a child, even temporarily, is a significant responsibility." Eliza's chin lifted slightly. "I run a 3,000-acre ranch with 27 employees, Mr. Montgomery. I believe I can manage one small girl for a few weeks." Despite her confident words, Jack sensed underlying uncertainty. Eliza Blackwood might be supremely competent in business and ranch management, but children, particularly emotionally vulnerable ones, presented challenges that couldn't be addressed with ledgers and efficient systems. Of course, he agreed, not wanting to undermine her offer by expressing doubt. It would be an ideal arrangement, especially from Sadie's perspective. A private room in a family home would be far less intimidating than being the sole occupant of a dormitory designed for many children. Eliza nodded, seemingly relieved he hadn't questioned her capabilities further. Then it settled. I'll have a room prepared and speak with Mrs. Gonzalez about appropriate considerations for a child of that age. Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood. Jack hesitated, then added, There's one more thing you should know about Sadie. According to the telegram, her guardian died 3 weeks ago. She's likely still in the acute stages of grief, which can manifest in various ways: nightmares, withdrawal, emotional outbursts. It might be challenging. I understand, Eliza said quietly. Something in her tone suggested she understood all too well. I'll ensure she's given appropriate space for her feelings. They spent the next hour discussing practical arrangements. Jack would meet the stage and bring Sadie to Mrs. Lang's store, where Eliza would join them to help select necessary clothing and personal items before taking the child to the ranch. Jack would visit daily to build familiarity and trust, gradually introducing Sadie to the orphanage as it was fully prepared for regular occupation. As Jack prepared to leave, a thought occurred to him. We should probably warn Thomas Reed that circumstances have accelerated our timeline. As a council member, he's been particularly attentive to our regulatory compliance. Eliza's expression hardened slightly. I'll handle Mr. Reed. His concerns about the orphanage have more to do with thwarted personal ambitions than genuine civic interest. Jack nodded, grateful for her willingness to manage that potentially difficult interaction. As he mounted his horse to return to town, he found himself reflecting on the unexpected turn their friendship had taken. When he planned to inform Eliza of Sadie's arrival, he hadn't expected Eliza to offer her home for their first orphan. It was a level of involvement he never would have predicted from the cool, reserved widow he'd first encountered in the mayor's office a few months prior. Chapter 9. The first child arrives. Thursday began with unexpected clouds gathering on the horizon, promising a break in the summer heat. Jack waited at the stage depot, his stomach tightening with nervous anticipation. Though he had worked with numerous orphan children during his time with the Children's Aid Society, becoming directly responsible for one was a profound step, and a commitment he didn't take lightly. The stage arrived precisely on schedule, dust billowing around the 6-horse team as it pulled to a halt before the depot. Passengers began disembarking. A traveling salesman, an older couple, a young man who appeared to be a salesman, and finally, a small figure in a faded blue dress, clutching a cloth bag to her chest with white-knuckled intensity. Jack knew this young girl was Sadie Miller. She stood motionless beside the stage, her thin shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow, her gaze fixed firmly on the ground. She was small for 8, with light brown hair pulled back in a simple braid and a sprinkling of freckles across a too-pale face. Jack's heart twisted at the lost, abandoned look of her, a look he recognized all too well from his own childhood. "Sadie," he said gently, approaching slowly and crouching to her eye level. "I'm Jack Montgomery. I received the telegram about your arrival." The child glanced up briefly, revealing reddened eyes and dark circles that spoke of insufficient sleep. She didn't speak, but gave a tiny nod of acknowledgement. "I know this is all very strange and frightening," Jack continued, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Coming to a new place, meeting new people, but I want you to know that you're safe here and that a lot of people are looking forward to welcoming you." Sadie's grip on her bag tightened, but she didn't respond. "Would it be all right if we walked over to the general store?" Jack asked. "Mrs. Lang has some ginger cookies that might interest you, and Mrs. Blackwood is meeting us there to help get some new things for your room." At the mention of new things, Sadie's eyes widened slightly, though she quickly returned to her guarded expression. She nodded again, a barely perceptible movement. "May I carry your bag for you?" Jack offered. This earned him the first clear reaction. She gave a vehement head shake and a step backward, clutching the bag even tighter to her chest. "That's fine," Jack assured her quickly. "It's your bag. You keep it as long as you like." The walk to the general store was silent. with Sadie staying precisely 3 steps behind Jack, despite his gentle encouragement to walk beside him. He didn't push, understanding that trust would need to be earned gradually after whatever traumas had brought her to this point. Mrs. Lang had been forewarned of their arrival and had prepared accordingly, clearing space in the back of the store for a more private meeting and setting out a plate of her famous ginger cookies alongside a glass of cold milk. Sadie eyed these offerings with obvious hunger, but made no move toward them until Jack explicitly indicated she should help herself. Even then, she ate with the furtive quickness of a child accustomed to having food taken away, stopping frequently to check Jack's expression as if expecting disapproval. When he showed none, simply engaging Mrs. Lang in casual conversation to reduce the pressure of direct attention, Sadie gradually relaxed enough to finish both the cookies and milk. The bell above the store entrance jingled, announcing Eliza's arrival. She was dressed more simply than usual in a blue skirt and white blouse, perhaps an intentional choice to appear less intimidating to a child. Nevertheless, her natural poise and self-possession created an immediate impression of authority. "Mrs. Blackwood," Jack greeted her, standing. "Thank you for coming. This is Sadie Miller, who has just arrived from Chicago." Eliza approached slowly, her expression gentle despite her formal tone. "Hello, Sadie. I am Mrs. Blackwood. I understand you've had a very long journey." Sadie ducked her head in acknowledgement but remained silent, her fingers working nervously at the frayed edge of her bag. Jack had expected Eliza to continue with practical matters, such as discussing needed purchases or explaining the temporary living arrangements. Instead, she surprised him by kneeling gracefully beside Sadie's chair, bringing herself to the child's eye level. "May I ask what you have in your bag that's so important to you?" Eliza inquired softly. Sadie hesitated, then slowly loosened her grip enough to open the drawstring top. From inside, she withdrew a small tin containing what appeared to be a collection of buttons. There were dozens of them, in various shapes, colors, and sizes, some obviously quite old. "My button box," Sadie whispered, her voice so soft it was barely audible. It was the first time she had spoken since her arrival. Eliza studied the collection with obvious interest. "What a remarkable assortment! Did you gather these yourself?" Sadie nodded. "My mama started it before she died. Then Miss Howard helped me add more." "Miss Howard was your guardian in Chicago?" Jack asked gently. Another nod. "She was nice. But then she got sick too." Sadie's lower lip trembled. "Everyone gets sick and dies." The simple, devastating statement hung in the air. Jack glanced at Eliza, expecting her to offer conventional reassurances. Instead, she surprised him again. "That must be very frightening," Eliza acknowledged, her tone free of condescension. "And it's not fair that you've lost so many people who cared for you." She gestured to the button collection. "May I see that blue one with the silver flecks? It's extraordinary." Sadie carefully selected the button in question and placed it in Eliza's palm. It was indeed unusual, with a deep azure with silvery inclusions that caught the light. "This reminds me of the night sky above the ranch," Eliza observed. "Have you ever seen the stars away from city lights, Sadie? They fill the entire sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet." Sadie shook her head, but her expression had lightened slightly with curiosity. "Perhaps you'll see them tonight," Eliza continued. "You'll be staying at my ranch for a little while until Mr. Montgomery finishes preparing your permanent room at the orphanage. Would that be acceptable to you?" The girl's eyes widened. "A ranch? With horses?" "Horses, cattle, chickens, and one very fat orange cat named Marmalade who thinks he owns the entire property," Eliza confirmed with a small smile. "He might allow you to pet him if you approach with proper respect for his dignity." A ghost of a smile touched Sadie's lips before disappearing. Will Mr. Montgomery be there too?" she asked, glancing uncertainly at Jack. "I'll visit every day," Jack assured her. "And in a few weeks, once your permanent room at the orphanage is fully ready, you'll come to live there. Other children will join us eventually, but for now it would just be you and me at the orphanage." "But Mrs. Blackwood would visit too." Sadie's question revealed that she had already formed a tentative connection to Eliza, which was unsurprising, given Eliza's unexpectedly gentle approach to the traumatized child. "Of course," Eliza answered without hesitation. "We have been working together on the orphanage to make sure everything is just right for the children who will live there." This simple explanation seemed to satisfy Sadie, who carefully returned her precious button to its tin and closed the bag securely. For the first time since her arrival, her death grip on the bag eased slightly. The remainder of the afternoon passed in practical activities. They selected necessary clothing items, personal care supplies, and a few simple toys for Sadie's temporary stay at the ranch. Throughout the process, Jack observed Eliza's approach with growing admiration. She showed remarkable sensitivity to Sadie's feelings, offering choices when appropriate but not overwhelming the child with too many options. She spoke directly to Sadie rather than about her, and she respected the girl's hesitations without allowing them to become obstacles. It was a side of Eliza Blackwood that Jack suspected few people in Aspen Hollow had ever witnessed. She displayed a gentle patience that belied her typically brisk, businesslike demeanor. The contrast was striking, and it raised new questions about the complex woman who he was beginning to have strong feelings for. Chapter 10. The Recognition. The next day, a severe spring thunderstorm thrashed Aspen Hollow with unusual ferocity, turning late afternoon to premature twilight as rain lashed against windows and wind howled through aspen groves. At Blackwood Ranch, Eliza moved through the house, lighting lamps earlier than usual, pausing occasionally to assess whether any leaks were developing in the older sections of the roof. Sadie's anxiety had been building with each thunderclap, her small body growing increasingly tense as she attempted to focus on the book Eliza had been reading to her. When lightning struck somewhere nearby with a deafening crack, the girl finally abandoned all pretense of calm, dropping the book and covering her ears with trembling hands. "It's too loud," she whispered, eyes wide with unmistakable terror. Eliza set the book aside and moved closer on the parlor sofa. "Would you like to sit with me?" she offered, opening her arms without pressure or expectation. Sadie hesitated only briefly before scrambling into Eliza's lap, burying her face against her shoulder as another thunderclap shook the house. Tiny fingers clutched at Eliza's blouse with surprising strength, the child's entire body rigid with fear. "I understand why storms are frightening," Eliza said softly, stroking Sadie's hair in rhythmic, soothing motions. "The noise, the darkness, the unpredictability. It's perfectly natural to be afraid." "Were you scared?" Sadie's voice was muffled against Eliza's shoulder. "When you were little like me?" The direct question triggered memories Eliza usually kept carefully contained, huddling alone in an orphanage dormitory while other children cried during a violent storm, clutching her mother's blue ribbon as thunder rattled the windows, wishing desperately for comfort no one offered. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "Storms terrified me when I was your age. I used to count between lightning and thunder to know if the storm was coming closer or moving away." Sadie lifted her head slightly. "How do you do that?" "You count seconds between seeing the lightning and hearing the thunder," Eliza explained, grateful for the distraction technique. "Each second means the storm is approximately 1/5 of a mile away, so if you count to 5, the lightning is about a mile from us." The next flash prompted Sadie to count aloud with determined concentration. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000. She reached 9 before thunder rolled across the sky. "That's almost 2 miles?" "Exactly," Eliza confirmed. "Which means the storm is moving away from us now. See? Knowledge helps manage fear." They continued this counting game as the storm gradually receded, Sadie's rigid posture slowly relaxing as the thunder became more distant. When the girl's eyelids began drooping from the emotional exhaustion of sustained fear, Eliza found herself humming the same lullaby she'd sung during the previous storm, the one from her own childhood that had unexpectedly returned to her memory. The soothing melody had nearly lulled Sadie to sleep when she heard a sharp knock. Her eyes widened in surprise at the sight of Jack Montgomery, his clothing drenched and water streaming from his hat brim onto the polished entry floor. How long had he been standing there? "Mr. Montgomery's here to check on Miss Sadie," Mrs. Gonzalez announced behind Jack, clearly disapproving of his dripping presence on her clean floors, even as she efficiently took his wet coat and hat. "Jack!" Sadie exclaimed, suddenly alert. She wiggled free of Eliza's embrace and ran to him, stopping just short of embracing his soaked form. "You came in the storm!" "I wanted to make sure you were all right," Jack explained, crouching to her level despite his wet clothes. "Mrs. Blackwood taught me to count between lightning and thunder," Sadie reported proudly. "The storm is almost 5 miles away now." Jack glanced up at Eliza, who had risen from the sofa and now stood watching their interaction with a complex expression. "That was thoughtful of her," Jack said to Sadie before addressing Eliza directly. "I apologize for arriving in such a state. The storm hit suddenly while I was checking the orphanage roof for leaks." "You're soaked through," Eliza observed, concern temporarily overriding her usual reserve. "Mrs. Gonzalez, please, bring towels and see if any of Mr. Blackwood's old clothes might fit Mr. Montgomery temporarily." While the housekeeper bustled off on this errand, Eliza turned her attention back to Sadie. "Perhaps you could help Mrs. Gonzalez find something warm for Mr. Montgomery to drink. Hot cider would be perfect for a rainy evening." Sadie nodded eagerly, clearly pleased to be given a useful task, and hurried after Mrs. Gonzalez toward the kitchen. Once the child was out of earshot, Eliza's manner shifted back to its usual composed efficiency. "There's a small sitting room off the kitchen where you can change," she informed Jack. "I'll have a fire started there immediately. Your clothes can be dried overnight if necessary." "Thank you," Jack replied, genuine gratitude in his voice. "I hadn't intended to impose, but I wanted to check on Sadie." "It was considerate of you to check on her welfare," Eliza acknowledged. "She was indeed quite frightened initially, though we've managed to turn it into something of a scientific lesson." Jack smiled at this typical transformation of adversity into educational opportunity. "I heard your counting technique as I arrived. Quite effective." Mrs. Gonzalez returned with an armful of towels and clothing, which consisted of a flannel shirt and woolen trousers that had belonged to the late Mr. Blackwood. "These might serve," she said dubiously, eyeing Jack's tall frame. "Though Mr. Blackwood was not so broad in the shoulders." "I'm sure they'll be fine," Jack assured her. "Anything dry is an improvement at this point." As he was shown to the sitting room to change, Eliza instructed the ranch hand who had answered her summons to build up the fire. She took care of the arrangements with her usual efficiency, though she found herself unexpectedly unsettled by the situation. By the time Jack rejoined them in the main parlor, Sadie had returned with a tray holding 3 steaming mugs of cider and a plate of ginger cookies. She had clearly appointed herself assistant hostess, serving the refreshments with careful concentration. Harold Blackwood's clothing did fit Jack imperfectly, the trousers a bit short at the ankles and the shirt snug across his wide shoulders, but the effect was not unappealing. The casual attire softened his usually serious demeanor, making him appear more approachable, less the determined orphanage director and more simply a man warming himself after being caught in the rain. Eliza found herself noticing details she typically tried to ignore. The breadth of his shoulders emphasized by the slightly too small shirt, the strong line of his jaw relaxed in appreciation as he sipped the hot cider, the gentle way he thanked Sadie for her careful service. She forced her attention back to practical matters, reminding herself that their relationship was professional, their current domestic tableau merely a consequence of unexpected weather. The remainder of the evening developed a strange intimacy, with the 3 of them gathered in the parlor as the storm gradually subsided outside. Sadie, reassured by both adults' presence, relaxed enough to share more about her life before coming to Aspen Hollow. She spoke of small details about her previous guardian, Miss Howard's kindness, memories of her mother's button collection, and her fear that happiness never lasted. "Every time I feel safe, something bad happens," she confessed softly. "Mama died, then Miss Howard died. I'm afraid." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. "You're afraid something will happen to us," Jack finished gently. Sadie nodded, her small face solemn. "The other children at the mission said orphans are cursed. That's why no one wants to keep us forever." Eliza felt a sharp ache at these words, memories of similar cruel taunts from her own childhood surfacing despite her efforts to suppress them. Before she could respond, however, Sadie's eyelids began drooping, the emotional exhaustion of the day finally overtaking her anxiety. "I believe it's time someone was tucked into bed," Eliza observed, rising from her chair. "Shall we, Sadie?" Half asleep, Sadie allowed Eliza to guide her upstairs for bedtime preparations. As they went through the now familiar routine of washing, changing into nightclothes, and brushing hair, Eliza found herself reflecting on how quickly she had adapted to these maternal tasks that had once seemed so foreign to her. There was comfort in the rituals, in Sadie's growing trust, in the knowledge that she could provide security where it had once been lacking. Chapter 11. A Secret Revealed. When Eliza returned downstairs after Sadie had fallen asleep, she found Jack standing by the parlor window, watching the now gentle rain in the lamplight. He turned at her entrance, and something in his expression that made her instinctively wary. "She's sleeping soundly," Eliza reported, maintaining a practical tone. "The storm has passed, at least for now." Jack nodded, still watching her with that same contemplative gaze. "You handled her fear remarkably well. The counting technique, the distraction with serving cider, the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of her concerns about loss." "Children need honesty delivered with sensitivity," Eliza replied. "False reassurances only undermine trust in the long term." "I heard you sing her a song when I arrived. I recognized that lullaby." Eliza stiffened almost imperceptibly. "It's merely an old lullaby. Many share similar melodies, but not identical lyrics about meadowlarks and mountain streams," Jack countered quietly. "That song was sung by one particular matron on the Orphan Aid Society train that came through these territories 15 years ago. I remember because it was the only genuinely comforting thing any adult did during that entire journey." Eliza maintained her composed expression with effort. "A remarkable coincidence, then." "Not coincidence," Jack said, his gaze never leaving her face. "Recognition. Just as I recognize now why you understand Sadie's fears so intuitively, and why you connect with her in ways that go beyond simple compassion or maternal instinct." Eliza turned away, moving to tend the fire that needed no tending. "You're making assumptions based on superficial similarities, Mr. Montgomery." "Am I?" Jack's voice remained gentle, but his words carried unmistakable certainty. "I remember a small blonde girl on that train named Elizabeth. She cried during a thunderstorm, much like tonight's. The matron sang that lullaby to calm her. The next day I gave her my carved wooden apple. The use of her full name, Elizabeth, not Eliza, sent a jolt through her that was almost physical. She stood frozen, back still turned to him, unable to formulate a denial that would sound remotely convincing. "That girl told me her name was Elizabeth Connors," Jack continued quietly. "She lost both parents to typhoid and had no remaining family willing to take her in. She was 11 years old and terrified of storms because the typhoid that killed her parents had come during a rainy season and the association had burned into her memory." Eliza closed her eyes briefly, fighting for control as long-suppressed memories flooded back with painful clarity. She had indeed told the kind boy who shared his precious apple why thunder made her shake with fear. It had been one of the few genuine human connections in that desolate period of her life. "When the train stopped in Copper Springs," Jack went on, "we made a pact to remember each other. I took back my small wooden apple and cut it in half, one piece for each of us. It was a token that we weren't alone." Slowly, Eliza turned to face him, her careful composure finally cracking. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice strong but still a whisper. Jack reached into his pocket, Harold Blackwood's pocket technically, and withdrew a small, worn object. He held it in his open palm. Half of a wooden apple, smoothed by years of handling, the broken edge still clearly visible where it had been separated from its matching piece. "I have kept it with me all of these years, because I never forgot you, Elizabeth," he said softly. And I think, despite everything, you never completely forgot me either." The sight of the carved half-apple broke something in Eliza, some dam she had constructed between her present self and the frightened orphan she had once been. Without conscious intent, her hand moved to the small pocket hidden in the seam of her skirt, withdrawing its matching piece. The two halves, held in their respective palms, were undeniably parts of the same whole. Even after 15 years of separate journeys, they still fit together perfectly along the broken edge. Eliza moved to the settee, suddenly needing to sit as the weight of her exposed secret threatened her usual poise. "No one in Aspen Hollow knows of my past," she said quietly. "No one except you now." Jack joined her, maintaining a respectful distance while still close enough for private conversation. "The Harringtons changed more than your name, didn't they?" She nodded, her fingers still clutching her half of the wooden apple. "Everything. My appearance, my speech, my mannerisms, my history. Elizabeth Connors effectively ceased to exist when they took me from the orphan train. They wanted a project, not a daughter, a demonstration of their Christian charity that would enhance their social standing. And they arranged your marriage to Harold Blackwood," Jack concluded, the pieces falling into place. "When I was 18, Eliza confirmed. "Harold wanted a wife with social connections to advance his business aspirations. The Harringtons wanted influence with a wealthy businessman to salvage their failing shipping company. I was the transaction that benefited both parties." The bitterness in her tone was unmistakable, though quickly controlled. "Harold wasn't cruel," she added, echoing what she had told others. "He provided well and expected little beyond appropriate companionship and management of his household. When he died, I discovered I had aptitude for business that the Harringtons had actively discouraged as unladylike." Jack absorbed this information in silence, clearly processing the implications. "And now you guard your independence fiercely," he observed finally. "Because it's the first real autonomy you've experienced since losing your parents." The insight was so accurate it momentarily took Eliza's breath away. No one had ever articulated her situation so precisely. The underlying reason for her careful control, her resistance to emotional entanglements, her insistence on framing even charitable actions as business decisions. "Yes," she acknowledged simply. "Why hide your background so completely?" Jack asked, genuine curiosity in his voice rather than judgment. "Surely in a territory where many have reinvented themselves, an orphaned childhood wouldn't cause the scandal it might in Eastern society." Eliza's laugh held little humor. "You underestimate the power of gossip in small communities, Mr. Montgomery. My position here depends on respect. As Harold Blackwood's widow, as a successful businesswoman, as a woman of appropriate refinement. Being revealed as an orphan-trained child would undermine that respect in subtle but significant ways." "Would it?" Jack challenged gently. "Or is that fear the Harringtons instilled in you, that your worth depends on hiding your true origins?" The question struck at something so fundamental to Eliza's constructed identity that she had no immediate response. Had she perpetuated a deception that was no longer necessary? Or was her caution justified by the very real prejudices that still existed against those of uncertain background? "I've built a life here," she said finally. "A position, a reputation, a business that employs dozens of people. Risking that stability seems reckless." Jack nodded slowly, understanding in his expression. "Not suggesting you announce your history from the church steps," he clarified, "only that you consider whether hiding it completely is still necessary for your well-being, or whether it's become a habit that constrains more than it protects." Eliza studied his face in the warm lamplight. She could see the genuine concern in his eyes, and the absence of judgment or pity she had always feared would accompany discovery of her secret. This man, who had known her briefly as a frightened child, now knew her as a composed adult, yet somehow saw continuity where she had created deliberate fracture. "Why did you come back to Aspen Hollow?" she asked suddenly. "Truly, was it random chance, or did you remember this place specifically?" "I remembered," Jack admitted, "not with perfect clarity. I was only here briefly before being sent back to the orphan train. But I remembered it was a decent community with good people like the Jenkins family, who only sent me back because they genuinely couldn't feed another mouth during the drought. He paused, carefully choosing his words. When I discovered the orphanage property was up for sale, it felt right, somehow. Like a chance to create something meaningful in a place tied to my past. And now, to both of us, the admission carried implications Eliza wasn't prepared to examine too closely. Instead, she focused on practical matters, a habitual retreat when emotions threatened to overwhelm her careful control. "What happens now?" she asked. "Will you tell others about my background?" "Of course not," Jack replied immediately, surprise evident in his tone. "Your history is yours to share or keep private as you choose. I'd never violate that trust." Relief washed through Eliza, followed by a complicated mix of emotions she couldn't immediately identify. Gratitude, certainly, but also something else. Perhaps the unfamiliar sensation of being truly seen by another person without artifice or expectation. "Thank you," she said quietly, meaning more than the simple words conveyed. Jack seemed to understand the broader gratitude. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, and gently covered her hand where it still clutched the half-apple. "We made a pact once," he reminded her softly, "to remember each other. I kept my part of that promise, even when I didn't know what had happened to you or if I'd ever see you again." The warmth of his hand over hers created a connection that transcended their professional friendship, acknowledging a shared history that predated their current roles and responsibilities. For a brief moment, they weren't the orphanage founder and his wealthy benefactor, but simply Jack and Elizabeth, survivors of the same journey, keepers of the same memory, holders of matching pieces of a carved wooden apple. Chapter 12. Where Two Halves Make a Whole. The evening air carried a gentle warmth as Jack settled beside Eliza on the porch swing. Inside, Sadie finally slept after 3 bedtime stories and considerable negotiation about tomorrow's chores. The creak of the swing accompanied their silence, both watching as fireflies began to dot the twilight. Jack's shoulder pressed lightly against Eliza's, a casual intimacy that would have been unthinkable months before. "I received a telegram from the investors today," Eliza said finally. "They've agreed to the additional funding for the West Wing expansion." Jack nodded. "That's excellent news. We'll need the space by winter if the projections from the Chicago office are accurate." 12 more children," she said softly. "It hardly seems possible that we've come this far already." The conversation drifted to practical matters such as building materials, staffing needs, and the vegetable garden that would need expansion. But beneath the rhythm of their planning lay something deeper, a current neither seemed ready to name. When their discussion naturally ebbed, Jack turned slightly toward her. "You know, I've been thinking about something my adoptive mother, Ruby, used to say." Eliza smiled. "Your Ruby sounds like she was quite wise." "She was," Jack agreed. "She always told me that understanding was rarer than love. That anyone could claim to love you, but few people would take the time to truly understand you." He hesitated. "I've never felt understood by anyone the way you understand me, Eliza. Despite our different worlds." The admission hung between them, his vulnerability palpable in the gathering darkness. Eliza's hands twisted in her lap. "I'm afraid sometimes," she confessed. "Not of you, but of this. Whatever is happening between us." "Tell me," he encouraged softly. "I fought so hard for my independence, to build something that was truly mine." Her voice strengthened with conviction. "I've watched women disappear into marriage, their identities swallowed whole by their husbands' lives, their ambitions dismissed as passing fancies." Jack listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful. "I don't want to lose myself," she finished simply. Jack was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I believe a true friendship should make both people more themselves, not less. Like good soil helps a tree grow stronger in its own nature." His hand covered hers. "I'd never want to diminish what makes you, you." The understanding in his eyes nearly undid her. The tension between them shifted. deepened. Jack's fingertips brushed her cheek with such gentleness that Eliza felt her breath catch. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving her every opportunity to withdraw. When his lips met hers, the kiss was tender rather than demanding. It was a question rather than a claim. Eliza found herself responding with equal softness, her hand rising to rest against his chest. When they parted, Jack's smile held wonder. "Would you walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you." The question seemed weighted with meaning beyond the simple words. Eliza nodded, rising to her feet. They walked in silence across the moonlit property, their shoulders occasionally brushing. At the small stream marking the eastern boundary, Jack paused beneath an oak tree. "Do you remember the day we met? Not when we were on the train, but a few months ago in Mayor Wilson's office?" he asked. Eliza laughed softly. "How could I forget? You were so determined to prove me wrong about everything." "And you were equally determined to keep me in my place," he countered with a smile. "But there was something else that happened that day. Eliza," his voice grew serious, "I'm not a man for flowery speeches or grand gestures, but I know what I see in you. Strength and compassion in equal measure, principles that don't bend with convenience, and a heart bigger than you'd ever admit to anyone. But I don't want to change who you are or what you've built. I'm asking if we can build something together that's stronger than what either of us could create alone." They both glanced at the now completed wooden apple that lay between them. Tears spilled onto Eliza's cheeks. "I'm still afraid," she admitted. "But I'm more afraid of letting fear decide my life." Her fingers closed around his. "Yes, Jack. Yes to building something together." His kiss this time held promise and future, sealing their agreement more surely than any contract. When they finally drew apart, Eliza's practical nature reasserted itself. "The orphanage needs more space than the town property can provide. My ranch has room to expand in every direction." Jack's eyes widened. "Are you suggesting that we convert the ranch for the new orphanage?" she confirmed. "It makes perfect sense. The children need room to run and grow. We could keep a small house in town for business." Then she grinned. "And Mr. Reed can't do anything to stop it." Jack's smile spread slowly. "Miss Hamilton, I believe you've just proposed the perfect solution." Hand in hand, they walked back toward the house. Two halves of an unexpected whole. Epilogue. 1 year later. Eliza rocked gently in the wide chair by the fireplace, a sleeping infant cradled in each arm. The twins, James Ruby and Elizabeth Pearl, barely 3 months old but already showing distinct personalities. James had his father's quiet watchfulness, and Elizabeth had a determined set to her tiny jaw that made Jack laugh. The family sitting room had changed subtly over the year. Jack's carvings now shared space with Eliza's leather-bound books. Children's artwork adorned the walls, and a low table held building blocks and wooden animals waiting for small hands to arrange them into imaginary worlds. And in the middle of it all was two halves of an apple, now as one. Through the wide windows, the expanded orphanage spread across what had once been pastureland. Currently home to 12 children, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, the buildings formed a protective semicircle around a central courtyard, where chickens pecked and a massive oak provided summer shade. Voices drifted from the kitchen. Sadie, now 9 and fiercely proud of her status as big sister, was helping Mrs. Peterson prepare tomorrow's bread. Her laughter mingled with the deeper tones of the older boys returning from evening chores. Jack entered quietly, pausing to take in the sight of his family. The year had added new lines around his eyes. Parenthood and responsibility etched themselves into his features. But they also softened something in his expression. "Are the Jenkin boys finally settled?" Eliza asked. Jack nodded. "Third night without tears. I think they're beginning to believe this might be permanent." "It is," Eliza said firmly, "for as long as they need it to be." Jack lifted Elizabeth carefully from Eliza's arm, cradling his daughter against his shoulder with a confidence that had replaced his initial terror of her fragility. "Mr. Thornton's letter arrived," he said. "The Chicago office is sending 3 siblings on next Tuesday's train, ages 4, 6, and 8. "We'll be ready," Eliza replied. "The east room just needs curtains." After the twins were settled in their cradles, Jack and Eliza slipped out to the wide porch that wrapped around the main house. It had become their ritual. These quiet moments after the household slept, planning and dreaming together in the stillness. "I have something for you," Jack said. From behind his back he produced a wooden carving. It was larger and more intricate than any he'd made before. Eliza's fingers traced the delicately rendered tree, its branches spreading wide and intertwining. Small figures nestled in the curves of the wood, each one distinct and lovingly detailed. "It's all of them," she whispered, recognizing the children who had passed through their care. Some had moved on to permanent families, others would remain until adulthood. All had left their mark. "A family tree," Jack explained, "not made from blood, but from choice and commitment. Every child who finds shelter in these branches becomes part of its strength." Eliza leaned against his shoulder, the carving cradled in her hands. "Ruby was right, you know. Love is stronger than circumstance." Jack pressed a kiss to her temple. She would have loved seeing this and what we've built together. They sat in a moment of silence, contemplating room arrangements for the new arrivals, then debating the merits of different schooling approaches for the older children, while enjoying their partnership that had become as natural as breathing. The night wrapped around them as their voices blended in the darkness, two halves of a whole creating branches strong enough to support all the children who would come to rest within their shelter.